Ladies and gentlemen, when a person is present every day, their value is often treated like air. It is everywhere, it is invisible, and it is only noticed when it becomes scarce. Many human beings do not know how to recognize truth while it is standing in front of them. They only recognize it when it leaves. They only understand light after the room has gone dark. They only understand love after it has stopped asking to be seen. They only understand the worth of a soul after that soul has withdrawn its energy and refused to perform the same old role in the same old drama. This is one of the deepest and most painful truths of human psychology. People often do not relate to the real you, but to the version of you that keeps accommodating them. They relate to your patience, not your presence. They relate to your giving, not your being. They relate to the way you soften yourself so that others do not have to confront themselves. And then one day you step back. You do not beg. You do not chase. You do not explain yourself into exhaustion. You simply become absent. And suddenly, what was hidden comes into the open. That is when they begin to feel the weight of your absence. That is when they begin to sense what they took for granted. That is when the truth they could not escape begins to reveal itself. Because absence is a mirror. It reflects what presence had been covering. It exposes dependency, regret, denial, attachment, and sometimes even selfishness. It reveals who was loving you and who was merely using your closeness to feed their comfort. Ladies and gentlemen, Carl Jung taught us that the human being is not one simple character, but a world of inner contradictions. We are not only what we say we are. We are also what we deny, what we suppress, what we project, and what we fear to see in ourselves. When someone loses you, they are often not only grieving your departure, they are also confronting the parts of themselves that your presence had allowed them to avoid. Your absence becomes a psychological event. It forces them to meet their shadow. And what is the shadow? It is the part of the self that does not want to be known. It is all the feelings, motives, weaknesses, and truths that the ego would rather keep buried. Many people do not realize that the strongest reactions to your absence often come from the shadow, not from love. They do not react only because they miss you. They react because your absence makes them face their emptiness. They react because the noise is gone, and now they can hear the truth. They react because the role you played in their life is no longer available to protect their illusions. There are people who only appreciate your light when it stops shining on them. There are people who only respect your kindness after it is no longer easy to access. There are people who only understand your depth when they are left standing in the shallow end of their own behavior. And there are people who only admit your importance when they can no longer turn to you for comfort, attention, validation, or forgiveness whenever they wish. This is why absence is such a powerful teacher. It does not flatter. It does not comfort. It does not decorate the truth. It strips everything down to its original shape. When you are constantly available, people can tell themselves stories. They can say, "They will always be there." They can say, "There is no risk." They can say, "We can delay appreciation until later." They can say, "Their loyalty is permanent, so our effort can be temporary." But absence destroys the lie of permanence. It reminds everyone that even the most generous heart has a limit. Even the most patient soul has a boundary. Even the most loyal person can decide that enough is enough. And when that moment comes, the real test begins. Not the test of whether they can say the right words. Not the test of whether they can post the right message. Not the test of whether they can appear emotional after the fact. The real test is whether they can tell the truth to themselves. Because there is a difference between missing someone and understanding them. There is a difference between wanting someone back and recognizing what they meant. There is a difference between regret and insight. Regret often arrives too late. Insight arrives when the ego is honest enough to stop defending itself. Ladies and gentlemen, when your absence reveals the truth they could not escape, it is because your withdrawal removes the psychology of convenience. As long as you are present, they can rely on your empathy to smooth over their neglect. As long as you are present, they can take your understanding for granted. As long as you are present, they can confuse your patience with permission. But once you leave, your silence begins to speak louder than all the conversations ever did. Your absence becomes a language that cannot be interrupted. And what does it say? It says, "I was more important than you admitted." It says, "You were safer with my presence than you knew." It says, "Your comfort depended on what you refused to value." It says, "The truth you ignored has now become impossible to deny." That is the hidden power of absence. It does not force anyone to love you. It only forces them to see. And seeing is often more painful than losing, because losing can still be blamed on circumstance. Seeing requires responsibility. Seeing requires admission. Seeing requires a person to say, "I did not notice what I had," or even worse, "I noticed and I still did not care enough." That is why some people panic when you step away. They do not merely miss your presence, they miss the stability your presence created around their identity. Some people build their sense of worth, security, and emotional balance around the fact that you are there. They become used to your emotional labor. They become dependent on your understanding. They become accustomed to your loyalty. And then your absence reveals something uncomfortable. They had not only loved you, they had leaned on you, sometimes too much, sometimes unfairly, sometimes without gratitude. Carl Jung would remind us that the human psyche resists truth before it accepts it. Denial is one of the first defenses of the ego. We do not like to face what humbles us. We do not like to admit that we were careless. We do not like to confess that we lost something sacred because we were too distracted by what was ordinary. We do not like to accept that a person we treated lightly had become one of the most meaningful presences in our life. So the mind delays, it rationalizes, it minimizes. It says, "They will come back." It says, "It is not that serious." It says, "We can fix this later." It says, "I still have time." But time is one of the most honest forces in existence. Time reveals the value of what ego ignores. Time shows who meant what they said. Time exposes the difference between attachment and appreciation. Time sorts the authentic from the performative. And when enough time passes, absence becomes a verdict. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a special kind of truth that only silence can deliver. When you keep speaking, people can argue. When you keep explaining, people can dismiss. When you keep forgiving too quickly, people can repeat their patterns. But when you become absent, they can no longer use your presence to avoid themselves. Your silence becomes a boundary. Your distance becomes a lesson. Your disappearance becomes a confrontation. And in that confrontation, they discover that the truth was never far away. It was always there, waiting beneath the surface. Your absence merely removed the distraction. It removed the comfort. It removed the illusion. It removed the easy assumption that you would always remain accessible to those who did not know how to treasure you. This is why some of the deepest respect in life is born after loss. Not every lesson comes gently. Not every awakening arrives with applause. Some awakenings are born in emptiness. Some truths arrive in the middle of regret. Some people never understand your value until they reach for you and find only space. And space can be a cruel teacher, because it offers no argument, no denial, no performance. It simply says, you are now facing what you once ignored. There is a tragic irony here. Many people are obsessed with keeping the things that soothe their ego, but they neglect the things that strengthen their soul. They chase attention, yet miss depth. They chase validation, yet abandon sincerity. They chase convenience, yet lose meaning. They chase what is easy to keep while failing to honor what is precious to have. And then, when the precious thing leaves, they realize that easy was never enough. Ladies and gentlemen, Jung understood that what we do not consciously value often returns to us as suffering. Ignored truths do not disappear. They wait. They gather pressure. They return in dreams, in tensions, in projections, in regrets, in repeating patterns, and in the emotional shock of losing what we assumed would always remain. Your absence can trigger this process. It can make the unconscious visible. It can force the other person to recognize the shape of what they lost. Sometimes your absence reveals not only their feelings but their character. It shows whether they are capable of reflection or only reaction. It shows whether they can self-examine or only self-protect. It shows whether they are capable of grief that leads to growth or only grief that leads to more longing. It shows whether they truly loved you as a person or merely loved what your presence did for them. This distinction matters deeply. To love someone is to see them, to honor them, to recognize their humanity, and to value their existence even when it asks something of you. To use someone is to enjoy their presence, their support, their kindness, their patience, and their emotional energy without fully honoring the cost. Absence often exposes which of these was present in the relationship. And this truth, though difficult, is liberating. Because once you know what your absence revealed, you can no longer be fooled by the same surface gestures. You can no longer confuse delayed regret with real transformation. You can no longer mistake emotional noise for deep understanding. You can no longer let someone's panic convince you that they finally see you, when all they may see is what they lost access to. There is dignity in becoming absent from what took you for granted. There is strength in no longer over-explaining your worth. There is wisdom in stepping back and allowing reality to speak for itself. And there is power in refusing to return simply because someone has finally become uncomfortable. Ladies and gentlemen, let us go deeper. Human beings often discover truth through contrast. We know warmth because of cold, health because of sickness, light because of darkness, and value because of loss. Your absence becomes that contrast. It sharpens perception. It draws a clear line between what was assumed and what was real. It makes people ask questions they were too comfortable to ask before. Why do I feel this? Why does this space hurt? Why does everything seem emptier now? Why did I not appreciate this before? These are not trivial questions. They are the beginning of self-knowledge, and self-knowledge is the beginning of transformation. Jung would say that the path to wholeness begins when we stop lying to ourselves. That is the great crisis of the modern soul, not merely that we are wounded, but that we keep covering the wound with distraction. We keep moving, we keep consuming, we keep performing, we keep pretending that we are fine. But when a meaningful presence disappears, the performance stops being enough. The room becomes too quiet, the heart becomes too honest, the unconscious starts to speak. That is when your absence reveals the truth they could not escape. It reveals that they were more attached than they admitted. It reveals that they were more dependent than they realized. It reveals that they were more careless than they wanted to confess. It reveals that they were less certain of themselves than they appeared. It reveals that they mistook your grace for endless availability. It reveals that they did not value your constancy, because constancy rarely makes noise until it is gone. Some people learn only through loss, some only through silence, some only through the sharp and unforgettable ache of realizing, too late, that what they had was not common at all. And that is why your absence can become a turning point in their life, not because it was designed to punish them, but because it exposed them, not because you became cruel, but because you became clear, not because you sought revenge, but because you chose truth over repetition. There is a moment in every soul's journey when it must face the question, what did I overlook while I was comfortable? That question is uncomfortable because it threatens the ego's favorite excuse, which is innocence. Many people want to believe they are good without having to examine whether they were attentive, grateful, and responsible. But goodness without awareness is fragile. Love without appreciation is incomplete. Connection without honor is shallow. And closeness without respect is only a temporary arrangement awaiting collapse. When you withdrew, you did not destroy the truth. You unveiled it. You let the mask fall. You allowed people to see the architecture of their own emotions. And what they saw may have shocked them, because the truth is often more severe than the story they had told themselves. They may have told themselves that you were always available. Your absence corrected that. They may have told themselves that they could return whenever it suited them. Your absence denied that. They may have told themselves that your heart would always remain open to them no matter what. Your absence proved otherwise. They may have told themselves they had time. Your absence showed them they did not. Ladies and gentlemen, there is something almost sacred about the moment a person realizes they cannot reclaim what they failed to respect. It is painful, yes. It is humbling, yes. It can even be devastating. But it is also real. And reality, however harsh, is the beginning of healing. The ego resists it, but the soul needs it. Without reality, there is no growth. Without loss, there is no reckoning. Without the interruption of absence, some people would continue living inside illusions forever. That is why your absence is not merely an event. It is an unveiling. It is a test. It is a mirror held up to every hidden motive, every delayed apology, every neglected truth, every silent assumption. It reveals whether the bond was based on depth or convenience. It reveals whether the affection was rooted in awareness or habit. It reveals whether the other person truly knew you or only knew how to receive from you. And now let us speak plainly. Sometimes the truth your absence reveals is this: they did not lose you all at once. They lost you gradually, long before you physically walked away. They lost you each time they ignored your needs. They lost you each time they assumed your patience meant permission. They lost you each time they chose comfort over care. They lost you each time they heard your concerns, but did not change. By the time you became absent, the loss had already begun. Your departure simply made it visible. This is important because many people believe a relationship ends only when a door closes, but sometimes it ends long before that. It ends in the repeated failure to recognize value. It ends in the quiet erosion of trust. It ends in the subtle feeling that one person is always giving more than they receive. It ends in the loneliness that can exist even while two people are still in contact. And then, when the final absence comes, it merely names the truth that had already been forming. Do not underestimate the power of being missed by the wrong people for the right reasons. They may miss your voice, but not your depth. They may miss your attention, but not your soul. They may miss your presence, but not your pain. And that is why your absence must be handled with wisdom. Not every reaction to losing you is proof of deserving you. Not every tear is transformation. Not every message is maturity. Not every apology is awareness. Jung would ask not only whether the conscious words have changed, but whether the inner structure has changed. Has the shadow been faced? Has the ego been humbled? Has the person become capable of truth, or are they merely afraid of emptiness? This question matters, because some people want your return without your absence having taught them anything. They want the comfort back, but not the lesson. They want the closeness back, but not the accountability. They want the warmth back, but not the respect that should have protected it. They want restoration without reflection. But without reflection, restoration becomes repetition. And repetition is where pain grows stronger. Ladies and gentlemen, the highest form of love is not dependency, and the highest form of respect is not possession. The highest form of love is to recognize a person while they are still near. The highest form of respect is to protect what is precious before distance becomes necessary. Because when someone has to disappear for their worth to be understood, the relationship has already been wounded by blindness. Yet even in that wound there is wisdom. Because your absence may become the wake-up call they needed. It may become the mirror they avoided. It may become the lesson that changes them. It may become the silence that finally teaches them to listen. And if not, then it still reveals the truth to you. It reveals who was capable of honoring you and who was only comfortable with having you. That too is invaluable, because once you know the truth, you stop negotiating with illusion. You stop offering unlimited access to limited awareness. You stop calling every emotional response love. You stop confusing familiarity with devotion. There comes a time in life when dignity matters more than explanation. There comes a time when leaving speaks more honestly than staying. There comes a time when your absence is not a punishment but a message. I will not continue to be present in a place where my value must be proven repeatedly to people who have already decided not to see it. That message is not bitterness. It is clarity. It is self-respect. It is the end of the old pattern. It is the beginning of a more conscious life. Because once you learn that absence reveals truth, you begin to understand your own power differently. You no longer fear being misunderstood by everyone. You no longer need constant confirmation. You no longer race to rescue every connection from the consequences of neglect. You begin to understand that your presence is not an entitlement for others. It is a gift, and gifts must be received with gratitude, not entitlement. Ladies and gentlemen, do not underestimate what happens in the mind of a person after your departure. At first, there may be relief, pride, or denial. The ego may celebrate freedom from responsibility. But later, the inner world begins to speak. Memory returns, moments replay. Small details become unbearable. A phrase you used, a habit you had, a way you looked at them, a kindness they never thanked you for, a sacrifice they never measured correctly. These things rise again. Why? Because the psyche knows what the ego refused to admit. The psyche knows when something meaningful has been lost. And in those quiet hours, the truth becomes unavoidable. They may realize that your patience was not weakness. They may realize that your calm was not indifference. They may realize that your silence was not emptiness. They may realize that your presence was a structure holding up a part of their emotional world. They may realize too late that what they called ordinary was extraordinary. That realization can hurt. But it is also the beginning of honesty. The question then is not whether they feel it. The question is whether they can learn from it. Because feeling alone is not enough. Sorrow alone is not enough. Regret alone is not enough. The soul must be willing to transform. It must be willing to say, I see now what I refused to see before. I understand now the cost of my blindness. I will not repeat this pattern. That is the beginning of real growth. And if they cannot say that, then your absence has still done its work. It has revealed the truth for what it is. It has shown you where the limits were. It has clarified what was real and what was performance. It has given you the most painful but necessary gift, the end of confusion. Confusion is expensive. It costs years. It costs dignity. It costs peace. It costs the soul itself when we keep returning to what repeatedly diminishes us. Absence, though painful, can break confusion wide open. It can end the cycle. It can force a decision. It can turn emotional fog into clarity. And clarity is freedom. So today let us honor the painful wisdom of absence. Let us respect the way it reveals the truth. Let us understand that not every loss is a failure, and not every departure is abandonment. Sometimes leaving is the only language strong enough to be understood. Sometimes silence is the only form of honesty left. Sometimes distance is the only thing that can expose what closeness concealed. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of all. People do not always learn from what they are told, but they often learn from what they can no longer possess. When you were there, they could ignore. When you were gone, they had to face. When you were present, they could delay truth. When you became absent, truth stood before them without mercy and without disguise. Ladies and gentlemen, your absence revealed the truth. They could not escape because truth, once unmasked, does not return to sleep. It sits in the room. It watches. It waits. It asks for honesty. And whether they answer it or not, the truth remains. So walk forward with this understanding. Your absence is not the end of your value. It is the revelation of it. It is the moment the world learns what your presence had been worth. It is the mirror that shows who was awake and who was asleep. It is the test that separates appreciation from habit, love from convenience, and character from performance. And when the truth is finally seen, when the illusions fall away, when the silence says everything the words could not, remember this: you were never too much. You were simply too real for those who preferred illusion. You were never hard to value. You were only in the hands of people who had not yet learned how to see. Your absence did not create your worth. It exposed the blindness of those who failed to honor it. That is why absence can be so powerful. It tells the truth without speaking. It reveals without arguing. It teaches without begging. And it leaves behind a lesson that, once understood, can change the entire shape of a life. Thank you.